Julian Assange is fighting an extradition request from the US over charges relating to the leaks of classified government material. He first made international headlines 9 years ago when WikiLeaks published a classified US military video showing a 2007 attack by helicopters that killed a dozen people in Baghdad, including 2 Reuters news staff. He was arrested last month after Ecuador withdrew its offer of asylum, and his lawyer says this sets a dangerous precedent for journalists around the world. Journalist and filmmaker John Pilger joins me now. John Pilger, welcome.
Thank you.
You've said Julian Assange's arrest is a warning from history. Who should be worried?
Journalists should be worried, first of all. This is part of a campaign against journalists, but particularly against the public's right to know. I mean, it's saying that if we as journalists publish something that governments really don't like, especially their secrets, they can lock us up for life. Certainly that would be true in the case of Assange. And if we try to protect our sources, they'll come after us, as in the case of Chelsea Manning.
Australian journalist Peter Grester is the founder of the Alliance for Journalists' Freedom. He himself, of course, was arrested in Egypt a few years ago. And he says Assange is not a journalist, writing that journalism demands more than simply acquiring confidential information and releasing it unfiltered onto the internet for punters to sort through. It comes with responsibility. Doesn't he have a point about that? Journalists actually filter the information. They tell the story.
No, he doesn't have any point at all. What Grester said is a disgrace, actually, and he's very much in the minority. I've been a journalist and a foreign correspondent and covered many wars and all the rest of it for a long time. Julian Assange is every bit as much a journalist as I am. What has changed is the digital revolution has allowed information to be much more widely available. And WikiLeaks is the first organization that has adapted to that and has adapted very, very successfully in what it's achieved. And Grester takes none of that into consideration. The issue with Assange here really is the Australian government, especially during the time of an election campaign. If Julian Assange this was all happening to him, this illegal dragging him out of an embassy and then giving him 50 days for some bogus bail infringement charge. If this was all happening in China, the Australian government would be jumping up and down, or any other country that was deemed to be rather hostile to us, quote unquote. But there hasn't been a peep out of them, and I've had quite a bit to do with the Australian government's non-involvement, studied non-involvement in the Julian Assange case. I once listened to, at a meeting, to the Australian consul in London say rather boastfully that his only knowledge of the Assange case was from the media. And that really is the issue here. The Australian government, right from the point when the Gillard government tried to interest the Australian Federal Police in prosecuting WikiLeaks and had to be told by the AFP that it had committed no crime, right from that point in 2011 to the present day, the Australian government has been very much part of the problem, and it could be the solution. It's Assange's government. It can bring him home.
Another topic you've written about is the ongoing crisis in Venezuela. Last night there was a candlelit vigil in Caracas for at least 5 people killed in the most recent street clashes following the opposition's failed call for a military uprising. The US, Australia and many other Western countries recognise Juan Guaido as the leader, but in January you're one of many writers and scholars who signed an open letter calling for the US to stop interfering in Venezuelan politics. Why did you do that?
I'm not exactly one of 6,248,000 people who voted for Maduro to be president. Actually, 9.5 million voted in the last election, 16 parties participated, and 6 candidates stood for the presidency, and he won with 67%. I mean, the disinformation out of Venezuela is quite staggering. Even my experience of disinformation over the years. The opposition represents what is never mentioned, and that is a white supremacy. Guaido and his group represent a very polarized Venezuela, there's no doubt. But on one side, the leaders are white supremacists. What Chavez did, and I suppose Maduro has followed on, is give voice in a multiplicity of ways to a mixed-race population that never had a voice in that country. That never comes through in the media. The idea that Maduro is a dictator is just ridiculous, or that he is Saddam Hussein incarnate, as he seems to be presented in some of the media, is also ridiculous.
Many say the elections last year weren't free and fair and that two popular opposition leaders were barred from standing. Isn't that enough cause for concern, at least to call for new elections?
No, you can say many say, but I would, as a journalist, ask you to deconstruct many say. I've just told you actually what happened, that over 9,389,000 people voted. A section of the so-called opposition boycotted the election. But frankly, if that opposition was doing what it was doing, let's say if they were doing in Australia or any other liberal democracy, I suppose we can call ourselves, they'd probably be arrested. They certainly wouldn't be allowed in the UK, and they most certainly wouldn't be allowed to do what they do in the US. It's sedition, it's treason. If this government can bring a case against two whistleblowers, Bernard Collery and Witness K, for showing what the Howard government was up to in East Timor many years later, then it wouldn't hesitate against the Australian equivalent of a Guaido and his group. The point is that no one has voted for Guaido. Absolutely no one. Millions have voted for the present president. That doesn't make him, Maduro, a particularly admirable leader of the country, but the world is full of leaders, and one could say including Australia, where that description wouldn't apply.
Mr. Maduro is supported by authoritarian regimes like China, Russia, and more recently Turkey. How does that reflect on his rule?
Oh, Guaido was supported by Donald Trump's regime. Trump himself didn't even win the election on the popular vote. I think Hillary Clinton won more than 3 million votes. That just flies in the face of facts to say that he's supported by an authoritarian regime. This country's biggest trading partner, Australia, is that same, as you call it, authoritarian regime, China. It's his greatest trading partner. And the same is true of many, many countries all over the world. The world is full of authoritarian regimes, but that doesn't mean to say we have to go to war with them.
John Pilger, thank you so much for your time.
Bye.
John Pilger is a journalist and filmmaker. This is RN Drive.